There's a guy in the place, got a bit of sweet face, and he goes by the name of Ebenezer. He's a good, he's a good, he's Ebenezer good, he's a good, he's a good, he's Ebenezer good. The Shaman, the only band in British chart history to delete a number one whilst at number one. For saying he's a good live on the BBC. Fuck me, it takes a long time to get through a crate of Tetleys. We're chatting about punk. The last couple of videos we kind of meandered round it a bit. You know, talking about AIHOEM and that. But we never really stared directly into the sun of specifically what punk was primarily influential for metal bands. Because, yeah, the initial explosion, it did have an impact on the new wave of British heavy metal, but for the most part, I think metal bands were a little bit bemused by it. They were invigorated by its energy, its aggression, its speed. But for the most part, they found it a little bit one-dimensional, a little bit limiting. They were after something a bit more expansive, shall we say. But there were bands that changed the course of metal history in a more direct and obvious way. And today we're going to talk about two of them specifically, who were relatively early on in the kind of weird antagonistic love-hate relationship that metal had with punk throughout the 1980s. But, you know, in the lineage of punk, I guess they are quite late. But when we're discussing punk, we do need to bear in mind that the punk is a real sort of micro timeline. Like, the explosion in Britain only lasted about a year, if that. But then, by late 77, early 78, we were getting the first kind of rumblings of post-punk. And it was, again, this push and pull between punk being an almost regressive act going back to early 50s rock and roll when it was still dirt simple, energetic, 3 chords, whatever. And then the pull of people finding that, no, it's too limiting, we need to expand out, we need to allow ourselves to play some arpeggios, to maybe have a key change now and then, maybe, you know, sing with a bit of a melody, let's not be afraid of pop. And post-punk was an attempt to kind of reconcile these two distinctive impetuses. I should say one reading of post-punk, because post-punk is a much more complex and multifaceted genre than the initial explosion of punk ever was. Internally, in the late 70s and early 80s, it played out this push-pull between the retro and the progressive even further, with, you know, punk bands like Crass trying to again pull it back, although this time with a very explicitly political message. The music again was trying to drag it back into the dirt of basic, accessible earworms that just got into you like a political rallying cry. And then you have more expansive visions that were bleeding into the early goth sound and Joy Division and Bauhaus and Susie Sue and all of that, trying to maybe kind of find a way to expand it into a slightly more ambitious version of what it already was. And then obviously you had the sort of pop face of it, which was kind of latterly dubbed new wave and things like that, which brought a degree of musical complexity, like bands like the Talking Heads, who were heavily inspired by the likes of King Crimson and things like that. And King Crimson themselves had a new wave phase in the early 80s with incredibly complex music, which was almost the antithesis to everything that punk stood for. But out of this
naughty, very naughty,
incredibly compact timeline where all of these competing ideologies were trying to gain airtime in the national zeitgeist, we have two bands who I think are probably as influential, if not more influential, than some of the biggest metal bands of the 1980s for the metal timeline itself from the early 80s onward. They are, of course, Discharge and Killing Joke. Now, we'll deal with Killing Joke first. Killing Joke are an interesting one because they do, early on, slot very neatly into the post-punk movement. like Jazz Coleman's, the vocalist Jazz Coleman's like early vocals were very much just kind of a slightly melodic take on anthemic punk of the late 70s. The guitars were somewhere between sort of jangly and distorted. The songs were quite basic and very, very focused on rhythm, on driving forward and engaging beats via distinctive repetitions. And it was almost like proto-dance music realized on rock instrumentation at this time. And this latter... Is there a rat? And this latter description would come to define their first few albums, and also come to define their influence on industrial music as a genre, not just industrial metal. Now, it's really the debut album that often gets called out here. Hang on, I'll just grab it. Normally the self-titled debut is the one that gets called out as the iconic one, and with good reason. There's many thunderous, iconic songs on this album that still get played in their repertoire today and still fill dance floors in goth clubs. You've got War Dance, you've got Requiem, you've got The Weight, the latter of which was covered by Metallica much later on, and many metal bands claim these as a key influence, not just the likes of your Godflesh and your Ministry, but also, yeah, Metallica. And many black metal bands also listened to a lot of Killing Joke. And they were very formative to the goth and punk movements as they developed throughout the 80s. But I always like to focus on their second album, What's This For? For two reasons. It does build on the template of the debut in a lot of ways, but it expands on the explicitly industrial elements. Now, although Jazz Coleman also did play synthesizers, their usage on these albums was very minimal and very understated compared to a lot of their contemporaries. The focus really is more on the riffage of Geordie Walker, and not so much developmental riffs in the metallic sense. They more pivoted on driving home a repetition, almost like a subversive earworm, in that they were anything but catchy, but they were repeated ad nauseum to the point where they did just drive into your brain. And they interacted with Paul Ferguson's pounding rhythmic emphasis that relied heavily on the usage of the toms, giving this kind of tribal, primal kind of feel to a lot of these tracks. And they kind of cut out the middleman of any kind of melodic or harmonic development, and Jazz Coleman, despite being an incredibly competent vocalist, was just pounding home these repetitive, aggressive sloganeering, as if he's trying to evoke a mass response from a crowd in some way, from a political podium. And he probably knew this because a lot of their later music videos on later albums would feature Jazz Coleman stood at a podium posing as some kind of politician, a Reagan or whatever. But here they take on a much more dark, almost occultist approach, and also the stage show would kind of have a lot of crossover with drama and the theatre of metal, like Jazz Coleman borrowed from The Crazy World of Arthur Brown with, using proto-corpse paint and fire would feature a lot in their shows as well. And they had a very kind of standoffish approach to live performances as well, where they're almost like daring the audience to do something about what's happening on stage. But yeah, on What's This For? You get a slightly more understated, menacing kind of variant of the debut with tracks like Fall of Because. Many might recognise that name for being one of Justin Broadwick's pre-Godflesh projects. You also get Follow the Leader, which many criticise for being a bit too referential of fascist iconography and imagery, but as with Killing Joke, everything was subversive and satirical. You also get these tracks that sort of pose as very middle-of-the-road post-punk, such as Tension, which the drum introduction to that kind of sounds like fucking My Sharona. But again, there's some sort of drab, kind of droll to the delivery of Killing Joke that makes it seem almost like they're satirizing the idea of pop music itself. Like, the drum beats and the bass line suggest that we should be dancing, stomping our feet and having a good time, but the lyrical content and the sheer overbearing grimness of the riffage speaks of something much more weighty and menacing. And indeed, Amoebics would later borrow from this a great deal as well. And this kind of churning atonal come dissonant kind of approach to just layering on guitar noise like this to otherwise pounding rhythms would become very formative to thrash metal in a lot of ways. And thrash metal is known for kind of taking elements of hardcore punk and combining it with the melodic ambitions of new wave of British heavy metal. But I would say for a lot of the like formative mid 80s kind of thrash, a lot of it borrows heavily from this raw atonality from this period of punk around the 1980 mark, where they are just trading blows with percussive punches. They're not really developing any kind of melodic or narrative framework here. They're just churning home an idea, hoping to grind the listener down into utter submission, much like a creamy, smooth flow Tetley's. Oh, how I love to drink on a Wednesday. And then you get the bacchanalian cacophony of a track like Madness, where the band seem to be genuinely descending into utter insanity, and all that anchors it to something that is recognisably musical is again the rhythm section, which is just pounding home a very basic, repetitive but oddly creative beat as well. And this would again come to define the sort of Killing Joke framework over the next few years. After What's This For, they churned out a few more albums, and then they kind of had a poppy turn with Nighttime, where many of their most famous and iconic tracks were released, like Love Like Blood and 80s. And then they went even more poppy and kind of off the rails. But ever since then, they've been riding this line of variant of industrial. Some people describe it as industrial metal, but I will never describe Killing Joke as a metal band, despite the crossover being more than apparent, because their focus was always on repetition, on creating a container for a particular sequence of ideas, usually very rhythmic, and Geordie Walker would only ever have sort of one or two ideas for each track. Incredibly good and incredibly effective ideas, allowing Jazz Coleman's vocals to soar above them, delivering melody when it counted, but otherwise just hammering home aggression and again sloganeering. And this kind of makes them stand apart from metal in a lot of ways, which is always focused on, you know, developing a narrative via riffcraft and sort of creating sonic architecture of some kind, whereas I would say Killing Joke are more focused on creating sonic infrastructure in a lot of ways. And that way they are kind of more like a dance band, in that they're interested in layering sounds around the same kind of circular idea, like you're going around a sort of ring road around a city or something. And with each iteration you might get some kind of new message or new kind of angle from it, new perspective on it or whatever, but it never really goes beyond that. But that was always Killing Joke's focus. In early thrash metal, borrowed from this very heavily, and you can hear it in early black metal as well, via the likes of Amoebics, who we'll talk about in another episode, and, you know, Celtic Frost kind of era, sort of that really kind of basic but very creative and intuitive way of crafting riffs. A lot of that comes from the Killing Joke framework in a lot of ways. Death metal, not so much. I don't think, aside from the textures, obviously, and the rhythmic aggression, I would say death metal is probably the extreme metal subgenre least tied to the Killing Joke lineage, just for the fact that death metal is anything but repetitive. It's angular, it's jarring, and it kind of focuses on creating the look of disorder whilst creating kind of a meta order above the clashing of transitions and riffs and tempos and so on. That was never really Killing Joke's focus. But in the early 80s, they were kind of an outlier in this sense, in that they weren't quite goth, they weren't quite post-punk in the Joy Division sense of the word, or, you know, they weren't straight up traditional punk either. They were far too empty, far too sort of devoid of any kind of humanistic energy. There was energy there, but it was always very kind of artificial, and it felt very synthetic. Even though it was created by humans, they were still using a real drummer, obviously, in Paul Ferguson, but the energy felt very mechanical, whereas punk of a few years before was very humanist. It was human focused. And speaking of punk that was human focused, we should probably talk about fucking Discharge. Now, it's hard to say anything new on this album, given the extent of its influence. I mean, there's a fucking subgenre named after it, the D-beat. And yes, it did sort of lay the rhythmic foundation for thrash and a lot of extreme metal that followed through the D-beat. And I don't really want to add to the discourse on that. You can just Google D-beat punk if you are interested. I think the interesting thing about Discharge is that they sit at that almost like they look like something regressive. In that, when I mentioned earlier on, there was a post-punk movement that kind of took the regression aspect again to an extreme, much like Crass did at the time with anarcho-punk, and Discharge were part of that and were dubbed hardcore punk. But for Discharge, they took regression to such an extreme that it began to look like, maybe not progression, because that would be a bit of a stretch, but let's say subversion.
Oh, what a carry-on!
They subverted the very idea of heavy, fast, energetic music being about the moment, about the hedonism, shall we say, because I think that was the discourse throughout much of the 70s was, for instance, prog rock. It did away with the hedonism because it got too brainy and esoteric, and it kind of forgot its audience just wanted to have a good time on the weekend. Punk was kind of an extreme iteration of that. Yes, they were trying to protest against something, and a lot of the early punk bands did have a message, but ultimately, most of the people that got into punk were just there for a good time. Discharge took the sonic elements of this, the heavier aspects of bands like the Damned, Sex Pistols, and the Clash, to such an extreme, and they reverted the pop sensibilities of these bands back to the utter basics. So a lot of the tracks on Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing, they have a verse and a chorus, but that's about it. And they have a riff, but one could hardly call it catchy in the same way that the riff on God Save the Queen is catchy. And the vocals obviously lacked all melody, they're just barks of like one or two line sloganeering, a kind of formative Napalm Death and DRI, in that they just... But they bark forth one or two lines about fear of nuclear armament, about world hunger in the face of kind of, you know, the new greed of the Thatcher and Reagan era. Through that, you kind of almost get a sense of nihilism from it. It's almost as if the vocals are desperately trying to cling on to a sense of a moral compass, a sense of having some sort of value, that there's something worth protecting in the society that these kids found themselves in the emerging 1980s. But they're fighting against these distorted sirens of the guitar tone that's working through very basic riffs, but again, very creative riffs. They have an urgency, but almost like a lackadaisical urgency. They don't have the aggression of Crass or the immediacy of the Exploited. They're more ethereal, almost. And I don't think anyone's ever described the guitars on Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing as ethereal ever. But I think I'm going to stand by that description, because they kind of almost transcend the context in which they find themselves in. We could just say these are dirt simple, like 2 or 3 chord songs with a verse, a chorus made up of 2 or 3 lines. All of the tracks are under 3 minutes, some of them are under 2, and they all just have about 2 ideas per track, and job done. And it was all about the drums and the kind of atonal aggression that kind of influenced the likes of Slayer and so on. But I think that's a little bit of a simplistic view. I think that Discharge were bringing forth a sense of overbearing nihilism, but also demonstrating the conflict within the music itself via the vocals that were just trying to hammer home these like slogans, trying to hammer home the message of punk still somehow, and the guitars fighting against that and kind of reminding us of the utter futility of individual action in the like face of the forces that these kids were facing at the time, and you know, with the Cold War reheating itself and everything. And I think that's the real power of this album is the guitar tone combined with the weird kind of sway of a lot of the riffs as they kind of ride over the hammering, you know, D-beat drums. It kind of creates this weird off-kilter vibe. It's almost like atmospheric in a lot of ways. They don't sound like a garage band on this album. They sound very theatrical. They sound very cinematic almost. Again, it's an abrasive album. It is, you know, it's distorted and it's aggressive and it's rough around the edges. But unlike other Abrasive albums, you don't feel like you're in the practice room with them. You don't feel like you're listening to them in the garage. It does feel like it's emanating from a more abstract space, a more kind of conceptualized space, where the very presentation and the recording and the performance is part of the message itself, on top of the kind of more obvious influences that this album has. And I think that's the really special thing about this Discharge album. And again, unlike Killing Joke, Discharge did not go on to have a long and lustrous career. They had a bit of a funny turn in the 80s, as a lot of punk bands did.
Is that the funny bit over?
But that's another reason why this album kind of stands above the reputation of Discharge themselves, and above the reputation of an influence of hardcore punk itself as a genre on thrash that followed. I think it stands apart as a statement of how it felt to be alive in Britain in the early 1980s under Thatcher, under the menace of like nuclear war. Obviously, they sample heavily from the Protect and Survive videos, which are a chilling public information video released in the UK about what to do in the face of a nuclear strike. And I think that kind of says it all when it comes to the preoccupations of these musicians. There wasn't the sort of glimmer of hope that still remained in the punk movement of the late 70s. That was gone, and it was replaced by desperation without cause. Wailing despair merged with the desire to still fight back and maintain some semblance of value matrix, to say that what we're doing, how we're living, is worth something. But you get, through the noise, through the atonal D-beat noise, you get this kind of sense that we're losing that conflict. And metal bands that followed would really latch onto that. They would dispense with the, by comparison, rather naive push and pull, conflicting that with more of a kind of fantastical, esoteric, occultist kind of preoccupation. And I think thrash would come in and start dispensing with occultism altogether and going more for realism in their lyrics. And to some extent, that was a necessary course correction for the kind of direction that a lot of, traditional heavy metal bands were going. I think that sometimes we do get carried away with talking about, the Satanism and the occultism being a metaphor for XYZ. I think there is definitely something to that, and later death metal would go to great extremes to expand upon that, and we'll discuss that in greater length another time. But as far as the early 80s were concerned, I think thrash needed that course correction. It needed that drop of realism to give the bands a sense of urgency, to give them motivation to do what they did. And combining that with the esotericism of, earlier metal with its kind of occult and satanic vibe would yield like very interesting philosophical results. But I think the course correction that hardcore punk gave it also allowed metal to ground itself in a sense of relevancy, and always kind of take the temperature of the zeitgeist and make sure that the art that they were producing was somehow relevant to the social environment that it found itself in. And albums like Discharge's Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing kind of gave them a mechanism to express that. Killing Joke, on the other hand, were far more abstract, in some ways far more nihilistic, but they were much more oblique in the way that they delivered their concern for the direction that society was taking during the Cold War. And as a result, their influence is a bit harder to kind of place. It's a much more kind of nebulous concept. But when you listen to the first 2 or 3 Killing Joke albums, you do really start to understand the influence that they had, even unknowingly, for a lot of bands around that time. So to some extent, we could say these albums were punk rediscovering itself, rediscovering how to maintain that street level grounded immediacy and urgency, and reinvigorate the listeners with this sense of purpose. But they're also not falling into the trap of saying, oh, it's all about basic rock and roll, it's all about being accessible and democratic. I think Killing Joke and Discharge were very good at combining the accessibility with a sense of, no, this is still art, this is still making a statement, this is still incredibly serious in a very unpretentious way, but the message was no less complex for that fact. they were able essentially to communicate very nuanced ideas, very unique perspectives on the times that they found themselves in, whilst maintaining the austerity of the original punk explosion.